I'll just run through a couple highlights of Becky, just because I think they're pretty cool. Bart mentioned her book, Out of the Salt Shaker and Into the World. Christianity Today named this book one of the 50 most important books of the last 50 years. And then her new book, which we have on sale, Stay Salt, which Tim Keller endorsed, Gospel Coalition called that the best book in evangelism and apologetics for 2020. Becky's husband Dick is back there, and he's listening and praying for us as well. They've been married for a long, long time. They have 3 adult children, 8 grandchildren. One of the things I think is really unique about Becky is that her and Dick have lived in Europe for a handful of years, and I feel like that time in Europe, there's a lot for us to learn from it, because Europe is, I think, uniquely challenging, just like the Bay Area is. But when you spend time with Dick and Becky, like they don't just kind of wallow in the challenges. They are just filled with hope in what God is doing all over the world. We spent time just even praying for our cities today as we drove over here. I'm really excited for you guys, for us together to learn from Becky. Let's give Becky a warm welcome one more time.
I am really delighted to be here, to be able to speak to you at Stratum. I've been very excited with all that I have heard about Stratum, and just, I love speaking to pastors. I have such a heart for you because I know how many hats you wear. And having worked so, in the field and working in the area of evangelism and talking to so many pastors, ministers, leaders, I just thank God for you. I really do. And I often pray that He will encourage, especially in this country, that He'll encourage you in ways that you couldn't even have imagined. And so I am really, really happy to be here. I decided that I'm going to begin in a way I never do, but just so that you can get to know me a little bit, I want to tell you really quickly just some things about me, and then get on to what is why I've come here. I was not raised in a Christian home. I was the first person in my family to know the Lord. My grandparents on both sides were not believers. My aunts and uncles, my first cousins, nobody went to church. And I became a Christian, which is a story in itself, at the age of 18. I remember talking to my paternal grandmother. I'm from Champaign, Illinois. She lived in Urbana, where the University of Illinois is, and where I did graduate work. And my grandmother goes, "Well, I've heard you've become religious." And I said, yeah, that is exactly the first word I would choose to describe what's happened to me. And she goes, and it was so funny, because she's like, "Oh, Becky, I just can't understand it. You were such a good student. You were so smart. What happened?" And then she goes, "And you were a cheerleader." How could this be? All right, so there was no understanding whatsoever. Then she said, "I wish you could have met your great-great-grandfather." Well, I said, "Oh my goodness, was my great-great-grandfather a Christian?" She said, "For heaven's sakes, Becky, he was a Boy Scout." I said, "Yeah." I was thinking of a slightly narrower definition, but I said, "Did he read the Bible and pray?" She said, "I didn't say he was a fanatic." Okay, so that gives you a little idea of my religious heritage. They weren't hostile to faith. They just couldn't understand what had happened to me. I then go away to college, didn't do the University of Illinois. I wanted to be out of state. Did my BA in English literature, came back to Champaign, did my master's in English literature, and was just getting started to do my PhD in English. Now, I've been a Christian now since I was 18. InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in Champaign came to me, and they said, "We really, really want you to take a year, 2 years, whatever, off and join and become a staff worker." And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, that could be interesting. And then they said, and we have exactly, because they knew me well by then, and they said, we know exactly where we want to send you. We want you to go to Portland, Oregon and work at Reed College. Now, I don't know, do you know Reed? Do you know? Okay, all right. Yes. So I thought, U.S. News and World Report did a piece on Reed, well, maybe about 10 years ago, as being one of the most academic universities in America, the most wildly liberal, and the farthest from God. Now, that would absolutely describe Reed when I was there. I did Reed, Willamette, and Whitman, the private colleges. So I fly to Portland. I begin my work at Reed. What was so fascinating is that Reed became my teething ring for ministry. That's really where I started doing evangelism. Because well, that's not entirely true, because in my undergraduate years, which I hope to tell you later, my junior year, I went to Spain, and I tell that whole story in Out of the Salt Shaker. Had a mentor, a woman that I got to know who was the IFES, the umbrella organization of InterVarsity. And she asked me, I was in Madrid, she asked me to move to Barcelona and said, I would really like you to live in the apartment. And she asked another student. She became a tremendous influence in my life, evangelistically. But anyway, I am now at Reed, and all the students, the Christian students, my first talk that I ever gave in my life was at Reed. And it was for the large group fellowship. The large group was about 15. So 15 Christians were there. She says, all the students were saying, Christian students, how in the world do we witness in a culture like this? How are we going to share our faith in a place that is so secular, so academic, so hostile to faith? So that's where I started. And I started looking at the Bible. How do I develop evangelism training tools? I cared a great deal about evangelism. I'd had an extraordinary experience in Spain. But now I'm 23 years old. I'm working at Reed. I am trying to develop equipping for evangelism for these students. If you had asked me, are you an evangelist? I would have said, oh, no, of course not. I'm not an evangelist. Do you know the first person who told me that I was an evangelist? Do you know Earl Palmer? You know who he is? He was, I was in Portland, of course. He was at UPres in Berkeley. And I said, Earl, I don't know what to do. They're all asking me, I'm trying really hard, and I'm looking at how do I develop training tools. And he said, Becky, you don't know that you're an evangelist? I said, oh, no, I'm not an evangelist. I mean, Billy Graham and all that, but I'm not an evangelist. He said, oh, yes, you are. And he said, Becky, here's your challenge. Your challenge is going to be, how do you take what you do so naturally, that comes so easily for you, and how are you going to help the majority of Christians who don't have the gift of the evangelist? That is a unique gift. But not a lot of people have it. Your challenge is, how do you take what you know, but give them training and tools and help, so that though they don't have the gift of the evangelist, they will start feeling confident and competent to be witnesses. Those were prophetic words, never imagining that would be what I would do for the rest of my life. I owe Earl so much. So I'm at Reed. I do 5 years. I'm doing evangelism training at Reed, Willamette, and Whitman. I was asked by InterVarsity to write an article on evangelism, everything I was learning and what God was doing, because it was absolutely extraordinary what the Lord did in those colleges. All right. I write the article. There's a huge response to the article, and IVP said, you've got to write a book on evangelism. I said, oh, I couldn't possibly. He said, you know more than you think you know. And so at 27, I wrote Out of the Salt Shaker and Into the World. Now, it's so funny because now, all these years later in ministry, I'll meet people, and they have assumed I was much, much older when I wrote that book, and they'll go, oh, you're still alive? Praise God. All right. The book came out when I was 28, And what was unique, I think, about the book that I didn't realize at the time is that I was looking at evangelism through an incarnational lens. And I knew how much I wanted to reach my parents. By the way, it took a long time, but every member of my family, including my grandparents, including that grandmother, everyone came to the Lord. Isn't that wonderful? But it took time. Okay, so I am this incarnational lens. I was focusing on Jesus and saying his motivation, his message, his model, this emphasizing that we listen, we ask questions to unbelievers, we respect them, we have compassion, we have love. And this whole approach was what I was doing in the Northwest, but what I was communicating to them. Now, in the 80s, when the book really became popular, the approach largely in the church was preach and leave. Be very careful that you don't get contaminated. You don't want, you preach. It was a very high view of church, but almost no understanding of the importance of relationship. So I am saying what we need to do is not put our emphasis on numbers or techniques or formulas, but do it Jesus' way. Authenticity, compassion, credibility, spiritual power. Evangelism has slipped into the department of sales, and we've got to share the glorious news of the gospel in the context of authentic relationship. Well, writing that book absolutely changed my life, because all of a sudden, I'm now getting invitations to churches. And the amazing thing was, everybody seemed to be struggling in evangelism. So when I say churches, I'm not just talking about Protestant, evangelical. I was getting asked by Catholic Church, Orthodox Church, every stripe of the Protestant church. So I stopped doing student work and I began doing a church ministry. Okay, so really fast forwarding, because marriage and raising children and writing a number of books. Now our last child goes away to university. This was in 2005. My husband, Dick, who was in business, said, Becky, you have all the time now. You've been ministering all these years, but now you've got time you didn't used to have. And he said, I know there's a call on God, a call of God on your life, both as an evangelist and especially as an evangelism equipper. And I feel that what we need to do is do it together. I think God has, he wants us to go beyond domestic U.S. and let's just see if there's an interest globally. But he said, but to do that, I'm going to have to leave my job and we're going to do it together. And it was a big step. And that's exactly what we did. What was so extraordinary was that right away, we started getting invited to do this on every continent, over and over again. We learned the global north and the global south. And the world became very small. We were based in the US, and we would do half of the work in the States and then the other half around the world. Then in the fall of 2009, I was invited by Christian leaders in the UK and Europe to train churches and university students in evangelism. We said, we'll do it for 1 year. And it was really 7 months out of a year. But we'll do it for 1 year, and home for Christmas and home for the summer and with our kids, etc. And we ended up doing it not for 1 year, but for 7 years. We were literally doing training all over the UK and all over Europe, and on a continent that is considered probably the most secular of any place in the world, and in many places the most gospel resistant. And the fruit we began to see was absolutely extraordinary. And then I realized, oh my goodness, what the Lord has done. That I was living in Europe now and realizing I'd come full circle. that God had started teaching me how to help Christians, how to help those who, by and large, are non-evangelists, to be effective witnesses, to develop a holistic approach to evangelism that is relationally authentic, spiritually, spirit-dependent, culturally sensitive, and biblically faithful. And he came full circle because I was in a culture at Reed that was so different than the rest of America by and large. That was so gospel resistant and challenging and secularized. And I went, we've come full circle. Here we are in Europe, and I started doing this all these years ago at Reed. We returned in 2018 so I could write a new book on evangelism, Stay Salt, The World Has Changed, Our Message Must Not. We come back and in 2018 and realized how much American culture, how radically, how quickly it seemed to be changing from when we first started traveling. And we realized coming back from Europe that we had come back from our future here. I found myself identifying very strongly with Leslie Newbigin, because Newbigin, the missiologist, and he's been in India all these years, he's English, he comes back, now he's in England, and oh my goodness, I think this was in the 50s. And what he realized is that not only had England become so very secular, but he also saw the tremendous impact that culture was having on believers, and he now realized two things that were tremendously important. There were two audiences he had to reach now. He had come thinking, well, all right, how do we help unbelievers understand the gospel? And then he realized he also needed to do, how do we reach believers with the gospel? How do we help the unfaithful faithful, as he called it, sitting in the pews, who had been far more impacted by a secular understanding of reality. They believed in their heads, but often behaved, he said, more like functional atheists, unaware. And he said the issue wasn't the lack of power of the gospel. It was as powerful as ever. But it was the pockets of unbelief that were so often prevalent in Western Christians in particular. Newbigin also wrote that what he felt so strongly is that ministers would need resilience and courage and faithfulness, cultural awareness, and yet a far deeper dependence upon the power of God, the power of His Word, and the power of the Spirit for such a time as this. That's my story. We've been back since 2018. We're still traveling internationally and nationally. And the thing I want to look at is, and there's how do we help our churches become effective witnesses for such a time as this? How do we do it? And there's so many things, of course, that I could say, having done this for so long, but let me just say two things. The first is, we really have to understand what are the obstacles that keep believers from sharing their faith? What is it? And what is it that you always hear? We need to understand that, and we also need to verbalize it. So what are some of the things that we always hear? Well, what we always hear is, well, I don't have a gift. Thank goodness. That's really what's under. I just don't have the gift of the evangelist, but I am sure praying for Christians to come who have the gift and be able to share. I've got the wrong personality type. I'm not an extrovert like you. I'm not an expert. I'm not a professional. What if they ask me a question I can't answer? What if I offend? What if I'm rejected? What if they're hostile and have the stereotype from media and academia and all about anybody who calls themselves a Christian? And I don't know enough. I don't know enough about what is the gospel. I don't know how to defend it. I'm not sure how to even communicate it. Okay. Those are things we need to understand and that we need to address. But let me tell you, as somebody who has done a lot of equipping worldwide in evangelism, let me tell you the thing that I feel is often the most neglected in evangelism training. And that is that we tend to go just with their fears and immediately, and it's important, we respond to the fears and we respond to the obstacles, but we don't go deep enough. And what we need to do in training is we need to look and say, what's underneath this? All right, they're talking about having all these fears, okay? What's behind all these fears? For example, I put here, when I'm giving the fears talk, and you see here 80%, 10%, 10%, 0%. I started doing this a long time ago, and I'd say, okay, tell me, what are all your fears? Do you know what the 80% always was? Communication skills. I'm shy, I'm not extroverted, I don't know, how do you even raise the topic of faith? Very important question. It's not that all the questions they're saying are important, but 80% always fell into the communications column. 10% would be content. I don't know the gospel very well. I don't know how to communicate it, and I don't know, and this is really important, I don't know how to share the gospel without using a lot of God talk. How do you talk about sin? How do you talk about it in a way that actually is relevant to their lives, is helpful, and doesn't make them feel judged, but they're beginning to understand, why is life difficult for me? Okay, content skills. Third one, practical skills, 10%. I don't even know how to lead somebody to the Lord. Now this is why, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, why evangelism training is so, so important. It is very important to do events where we are proclaiming the gospel and bringing our non-Christian friends. But they're not going to bring their non-Christian friends if they don't feel the Christian's confident and competent. So we've got to make sure they're getting help so that when we are having events and inviting them to church, that will come. All right, 10% content skill, practical. Guess what 0% is? I have done this all over the world, and even in the global South, but especially in the global North with the Western culture, Western churches. Do you know what is never mentioned when I'm saying, tell me where you struggle, tell me where you need help? No one ever mentions God. Nobody ever mentions God's role. And I remember this years and years ago. I said, okay, now we've got all of this up here. Tell me, what's the primary focus that you see? What's the primary focus of what you're saying? And they go, oh my goodness, it's us. It's 100% about us. And I said, okay, let me tell you what the 0% is. Nobody asked, what is God's role? How do I stay in step with the Spirit? How am I able to depend upon the power, lean on the power of the Holy Spirit, etc.? And what does that reveal? All of a sudden, what they begin to see is, what it reveals is they're struggling not just with, how do I raise the topic of faith? That's important. How do I answer their questions? That's important. But what's underneath all these fears? Unbelief. They don't think God's going to come through, and they don't say it. I don't know that they even realize it. All right, but then I say, you know what we're really struggling with? We're struggling with unbelief, and that we, especially in today's culture, the difficulty in really leaning and trusting in the supernatural power of God. And what do you do when you recognize there's pockets of unbelief? And this is one of the things Dick does. We do these together. Then he'll come up and say, what we need to do now, what do you do in unbelief? We repent and we ask God to forgive us. And secondly, what do? Ask for the gift of faith. I can't tell you how much it helps them when they suddenly realize, wait a minute, there's something deeper here. What I am saying to you is that what I feel is missing so often in evangelism is, as we're teaching it, our theology impacts our methodology. We need to find out what's underneath, what's the deeper problem, and address it by looking at what's the great truth that God has taught us, where we can develop more confidence. It's not just tell me what to say. Just tell me what to say. All right. We can tell people, there's certainly things we can, what to say in terms of what is the gospel. But what people are struggling with, what they need, isn't just a good memory where we're telling them exactly what to say, which is what we don't want to do. What they need is faith. And how do we do that? We're missing, I think, the tremendous importance that it's our theology that impacts our methodology. Now, example, do you know what I hear probably more than anything else at the end of the day? Becky, I wish I could share my faith. I really want to, but I can't. I'm inadequate. Now, what we need to ask ourselves is this. Where did we ever get the idea we were adequate? Where did that come from? What we need to do is to be able to show them what is it when they say we're inadequate. I will say to them, I can't, I'm inadequate. And I go, well, of course you're inadequate. I'm inadequate. We're all inadequate if we love the Lord. But isn't it wonderful to know? Isn't it wonderful to know that adequacy is not required? Now, one of the things I teach, in fact, this is our evangelism, this is the conference that we do now with flexibility. But what is the very first thing of the talks that is given, and this has a video and all of that. Very first talk, inadequacy is compulsory. And what's the answer? Celebrating our smallness as we learn to depend upon the Spirit of God and His Word. Now, I wish that I had time to really give the talk about how we recognize what do we do about our inadequacy. But what I'm really saying to you is, you know what our biggest problem in evangelism is? We don't know what it means to be human. That's the problem. And we think we've got to know more, be more, do more. We've got to understand what does it truly mean to be human. A controversial journalist, Tucker Carlson, was recently converted. And he was saying that one of the things he did is that he read the Bible. Now, he was Episcopalian, but he said he knew that he didn't really get it. And so he decided to read the Bible 2 times. And do you know what he said? He said, when I finished reading, second time, the thing that struck me the most about the Bible, 2 things. One is the message over and over again from God was, I'm God and you're not. What is the problem we have with the sense of inadequacy and all of our fears? We don't know what it means to be human. Who can show us what it means to be human? Jesus. Why? Because Jesus, the eternal Son of God, came to us, became one of us, fully divine and yet fully human. Now, Jesus says in John 17, as the Father sent me, so I send you. Our ministry is to resemble His. And it's a tremendous lesson in what evangelism is to be. Well, how did the Father send the Son? As the Father sent me, 5 ways: birth, life, death, resurrection, and ascension. All 5 aspects of incarnational reality have tremendous impact on evangelism. Let's just look at the birth. the significance of his birth. You know, when the shepherds were watching their flock by night in Bethlehem, and I had the tremendous privilege of living in Jerusalem for 3 years, gave birth to my first child there. When the shepherds are there, the heaven breaks out in the choir and this delirious joy. Why? Because the news from the angel was, Jesus has come. And who was Jesus? And now, they didn't know yet, but heaven knew, the angels knew. And in Colossians 1, Paul says that Jesus, the very image of the invisible God, the agent of creation, who was unlimited in power and knowledge and who had never before been subject to time and space, came to us in human form. And how did he come? Not as a conquering king, as a baby. Nothing is smaller and more vulnerable than a baby. And what does Jesus' birth reveal? This is so important in life, and it's so important in evangelism. God is pleased to dwell and reveal his glory in human weakness. Oh, my friends, that is a theme throughout the entire Bible. All through the Bible, we see there's this profound relationship